transboundary aquifers where peaceful sharing of groundwater was resolved. And maybe to highlight that the UN has also been taking a focused attention to put member states together to outline some of the pressing issues in the water crisis domain through water decades. The first water decade from 2005 to 2015 was a successful experiment in doing or addressing water issues collectively, and the next decade started 2018 is ongoing. One clear message from this 10-year exercise, where many stakeholders were involved at various levels, was the water security framework and a working definition. The definition is on your screen. I'll not read through it, but I just want to emphasize it's generic because it allows reflection of sectors or aspects that are conventionally not the part of water management and governance, like relating water to peace and political stability, and also factoring in water-related disasters, so making that link with climate change and climate action. The diagram is very beautiful, but when you put this diagram into operation, the states, the communities are given their own flexibility to use it as they please, but to ensure that these key domains remain a part of their national and regional water governance, planning, and policy. So we have taken opportunity to discuss this conceptual framework, we call it, with several states. And many states feel that their entry point can be very different. For example, Pakistan said that they want to focus on economic activities and development related to the water sector to generate enough revenue to feed into preserving watersheds and water ecosystems to ensure a supply of drinking water. Just one quick example. So every state feels their entry point to this conceptual framework can be very different. A lot of literature on how UN has been supporting for decades the work on regional scale, the Jordan case study. And this I just wanted to highlight as a reference. The work has been ongoing, and the most recent document is this policy and analytical brief that we launched last year in January 2021, which was a review exercise to see why global water governance mechanism like the Water Resources Convention, where is it falling short? Where are the gaps? What are the future needs to ensure that it's operationally efficient, that it is integrated appropriately into national water policy and planning? And some of the other instruments and data and information and statistics that's helping to promote hydrodiplomatic discussions, because human right to water has, of course, been established 12 years ago, but by and far is not really reflected in many national policies. The UN Water Conference next year could be that high-level event to bring all these discourses back in the center stage. The statistics around water scarcity is pretty evident that we need more collaboration, more efficient partnerships to handle this crisis. So I'm leaving you here with a lot of numbers, a lot of food for thought to see that the crisis is far from over, though there has been spots of progress here and there. The Sustainable Development Goals was a welcoming milestone in putting a specific placeholder for Sustainable Development Goal on water, SDG 6, and then again as a target 6.5.2 on transboundary basins. So again, international, regional commitment to understand complexities that operate in shared water systems space. The progress on SDG 6.5 is pretty is full of good and bad news. I just picked up from a 200-page report. I just picked up 2 lines to give you a bit of reflection on how it goes on transboundary water systems. Of 153 countries sharing transboundary rivers, lakes, and aquifers, only a quarter have 100% of their transboundary basin covered by operational arrangements. And additional only 22 countries have more than 70% covered. So the data is based from 2017 to 2020, while there is a global acknowledgement that transboundary water cooperation can play a significant role in preventing conflict, in achieving sustainable water future for all. But in terms of actual operations, there are barriers, there are implementation gaps, there are integration gaps of existing instruments. And that points to the fact that perhaps we don't need more instruments, we need more focus on existing instruments. And we tested this hypothesis in the Lake Chad Congo Basin by working on a Trans-Aqua project, which is a big regional claim that is made in the form of a proposal that will influence the destiny of around 10 countries in the region through irrigation, livelihood opportunities, and economic development. And this Lake Chad shrinking story is globally known. I'll not go into that. It has been scientifically evidenced by scholars from political science, from biophysical science, and we have also had our projects to kind of reaffirm some of those findings. But the Trans-Aqua story that goes in parallel to re-watering the Sahel has been very interesting, because that's where some of these hydrodiplomacy discussions can make a difference. A proposal that was initiated in 1982 by Italian state-owned Bonifica then still is in a form of a proposal after 40 years, because discussions and consensus building, the use of those diplomatic instruments, the guidelines outlined in agreements to share water from Congo Basin to Sahel through construction of a 2,500 kilometer canal or channel has not led to a desired conclusion, where DRC Congo, where large construction may happen if the project becomes a reality, is not on board. Why is this? Because there are two regional entities, the Lake Chad Basin Commission and SICOS, the Congo Basin Commission on Water Sharing and Allocation. But these two have very different mandates. And this is even complex because we're talking about two transboundary basins where water will be transferred from one transboundary basin to another transboundary region, making the story even more complex. And an interesting element for this case is involvement of private sector actors. Bonifica, which is now a private corporation operating out of Italy, and China. So there are two private sector actors, and taking note of this domain, transboundary water governance domain, which has remained very much the affair of states and state representatives to discuss, agree, and build consensus. Now we have on board, in this case study, two private sector actors. So through a critical discourse and working with global scholars who are interested in the story around Chad and Congo Basin, from a hydrodiplomacy viewpoint, we argued that if such a project is implemented, the trade-off needs to be assessed cautiously. And the economic criteria has been very clear. This many people will benefit. And corporate profitability also is somewhere in the mix, but community consultation is totally out of all these negotiations so far. The local scholar from Nigeria, we have also been following how the local scholars are building their narrative. And I think the agreement is the key to peace in Lake Chad is water, not military action. However, Trans-Aqua could be that solution if hydrodiplomacy or tactical approaches to building consensus, to having more transparent consultation for taking this proposal to a project is agreed. And again, in the closing, just giving you an insight of different regions. My colleague Sabine just talked about the Mekong. Many countries, many regions now are embracing hydrodiplomacy as a potential tool that could help them settle some conflicts, build better cooperation through following guidelines or following success stories that may have worked as well. And a demand in the room is also that water and climate crisis is leading to cascading impacts. And one such impact is displacement, forced displacement and migration. I'm not going to go into detail of this, but I'll leave you with that thought of understanding that we need to capture, we need to understand all mechanisms that are available to us to settle these disputes. in a more amicable way, not to let human security become a big agenda through the water domain. Thank you, and over.
Thank you very much, Nidhi. That was very insightful, especially with regards to the migration and the conflict and cooperation around environmental diplomacy and forced migration, which I know you're very actively involved in with reports that are coming out. So we're looking forward to following that work. Next, I'd like to introduce Tobias Ide. Tobias is Senior Lecturer in Politics and International Relations at Murdoch University, Perth. His research deals with the role of water and other environmental issues in shaping peace, conflict, and security. His work has been published in a range of well-renowned journals, including the Journal of Peace Research, Global Environmental Politics, Nature, Climate Change, and World Development. Thank you, and over to you, Tobias.
Yes, thank you, Sane, and thanks a lot for helping me to overcome the technical difficulties. For some reason, I was signed in with my Zoom account, and whenever I clicked on join meeting, it claimed I wasn't signed in. And I don't know why. And I'm sorry you run a bit late because of that. I will try to make some time up. Okay. So the topic of my talk today is transboundary water cooperation and environmental peace building. So I mean, the basic idea behind environmental peace building is that environmental topics, and particularly water, are very well suited to bring groups in conflict or with tense relations together, because they cross political boundaries. They are positive sum games. If you address a water problem in one state and it's a cross-border water resource, you also address it in another state. It's not politically as contentious as, for instance, economic integration. And it's also an area where it's usually a lot of scientific and NGO or civil society cooperation already going on. And then by entering into water cooperation, states can basically work to build trust and improve their relationship. So that's the basic idea behind environmental peace building. And I mean, you see, I think, while water is quite key in there. So this table is from a study I conducted in 2018, and it's a statistical analysis between basically diets, that is pairs of states which are in very tense relations. And I basically compared for various temporal levels of analysis whether once they sign an environmental agreement, they are more likely to terminate their tense relationship and enter like a more positive relationship in 1, 5, or infinite years after an environmental agreement. And that covers water agreements, but also transboundary conservation. And indeed, as you can see with the odds ratios, I'm not going into the details of the statistics. But I mean, you basically see that states that signed an environmental agreement are much more likely to reconcile the differences in the next, particularly 5 years. And then together with my colleague Adrian Detges, who I think also works with Sabine in Berlin, I did a follow-up study focusing specifically on water using these water basin scale that it has like cooperative and conflictive interactions that Sabine introduced earlier. And basically we showed like how many, or we analyzed how many positive interactions 2 states in the same river basin had over the past 10 years. And then again, if states have a lot of positive interactions about water with each other, they are much more likely to improve their relationships with each other. And then, I mean, so basically the statistics tell you there is a pattern. And if you dig a bit into the cases behind the patterns, you usually see that the water cooperation was not the trigger of a new peacemaking or peace-building process. If water played a role, however, I mean, part of it was explained that states improved their relations anyway, and that also included water cooperation. But another part is that water sometimes, or actually quite often, was used to catalyze existing processes of peacemaking or reconciliation. So basically, the conflict parties were looking for an entry point, something to cooperate on, to basically demonstrate their new relationships, and transboundary water cooperation quite often was this entry point. It wasn't so in difficult contexts where the states had still very tense relations, but once the peace process was ongoing and the governments on both sides were willing to commit to the peace process, usually water could be used as a catalyzing factor, especially if there were long-established civil society or academics or low-level intergovernmental cooperation issues going on. However, I don't want to only show you the broad scale statistical picture, but also zoom into a specific case where I have done field research in 2013 and 18, and that is the Israeli and Palestinian territories, as you can see on those maps. And basically, Israelis and Palestinians share a number of water resources, including the Jordan River and the Dead Sea, but also the groundwater resources of the mountain aquifer, which you can see on the right side, mostly under the West Bank, and then the coastal aquifer, which you can see like along the coast, which covers Gaza and large parts of the Israeli coastline. And these water sources suffer from quite a few problems. We have a heavy overuse of the Jordan River, which is a very thin, very small river actually by now, leading to declining levels of the Dead Sea, declining water levels of the Dead Sea. We also have a heavy pollution of the coastal aquifer, and also a salination of the coastal aquifer, and this is aggravated by climate change challenges like rising sea levels or an increasing trends of more and more severe droughts. Due to the political tense situation, there is no comprehensive water agreement between the Israelis and Palestinians. It has also always been postponed to final status negotiations. But there is a lot of interdependence, as you can see from the natural geography, but also the water systems are in parts intertwined, and Israel actually delivers water to some areas in the Palestinian West Bank. And essentially, the situation is highly conflictive, and I'm not going into details here, but essentially, the water distribution between both areas is highly unequal. With Israel having having in the past, they had quite a lot of control about water resource development in the Palestinian territories. This situation has now improved, but there are still stark inequalities, both in terms of water availability and water infrastructure between the Israeli and the Palestinian territories. And it's the source of a lot of tension and confrontations. However, there are also initiatives like, in this case, the Good Water Neighbors project by EcoPeace Middle East, which brings together Israeli and Palestinian and actually also Jordan communities which share a joint water resource and basically support them in cooperating. And as you can see, it's usually two communities close to the border which have a shared river or creek or underground water resource. And the idea is basically we bring the communities together to cooperate over water resources to address a joint problem, but while doing so, also building trust. and understanding. And they do quite a variety of activities. They bring together actually young people in joint Israeli, Palestinian, Jordanian youth camps to talk together and learn about each other's water situation. That's the top left picture. They lobby policymakers. For instance, on the top right corner, you see these terraces in Batir, which are part of a World Heritage area. Israel wanted to build a wall there to protect its borders, which would have destroyed the terraces, and the communities on both sides, which also worked together on water issues, basically joined to fill petitions and work to prevent the construction of this wall, which was successful so far. And then they also, that's the bottom left corner, they also bring mayors together to basically join municipality level cooperation, water cooperation, including joint infrastructure projects. Even so, in the past, most joint infrastructure projects were vetoed by the Israeli authorities in the West Bank. And not much happened in terms of infrastructure development. And then all of these activities bring nice follow-up cooperation. Like on the bottom right picture, you see a photo of the Palestinian village of Wadi Fukin, which I made when standing in the Israeli village or town of Tzur Hadassah. They engage in some water cooperation, but by doing so, the people joined forces. And now, for instance, Wadi Fukin also sells some of its vegetables in markets in Tzur Hadassah, so basically to support the economic development in this Palestinian village. So there's quite a bit of cooperation going on despite the tense water and political situation. And this has quite a few benefits. It's measured that people who participate and join these programs have more positive attitudes towards the outgroups. There are lesser or fewer incidents of negative stereotyping, and more willingness to cooperate and accept the position of the other side. There is some form of livelihood security, for instance, with these market example and vegetable trade, but also some of the water cooperation actually include job trainings or skills trainings, particularly for young people. It's a visible signals in public debate. So the media cover this sometimes as an example of, see, Israelis and Palestinians can work together and we can bridge the borders and join together for the greater good. And there are some impacts on national decision-making, like not having the wall built in Batir, the border wall, or some adjustments to the Joint Water Committee made in 2017, which gave the Palestinians a bit better stake in their own water affairs. So we can summarize this transboundary water cooperation at a local, everyday level builds some forms of peace by promoting understanding, trust, sending positive signals, and increasing livelihood security. There are some problems, however, and I think the most important one is there's limited impacts on peace at the macro level. And I think that ties very well to what we find in the statistical studies, which is that, or let's say in the cross-case studies, that is, if there is a willingness and already some progress towards peace at the national level, then water cooperation can catalyze the peace process even further. If there is a stalemate and no willingness to move at the macro level, water cooperation itself is insufficient to basically make peace on an international level. So the impact remains on the local and everyday level. There are quite a few conflict-related constraints, for instance, the lack of mobility and the inability of communities to meet actually across the border. Power inequalities remain unaddressed in that a lot of this cooperation is obviously quite nice and beneficial, but it doesn't change the basic fact that both in political and in terms of water rights and water access, the Palestinians have a strong disadvantage and there's a strong inequality. And as a consequence, there is also local resistance, particularly in the Palestinian territories, where such cooperation is perceived by some groups as normalization and working with the enemy and legitimizing the status quo. And some of the people who engage in this cooperation have to be quite careful in order not to get, on the radar of these groups and then be pressured. So my key takeaways is that transboundary water cooperation can contribute to various forms of peace, always to more local level and micro peace, and if there is willingness at the national level, also to macro level peace. It mostly catalyzes pre-existing processes of peace and reconciliation, and only in certain contexts. And transboundary water cooperation can also fuel conflicts and local resistance and aggravate tensions. Sorry for rushing this a bit and for joining late, but thanks a lot to your attention. And if we have time for discussion, I'm also looking forward to that.
Thank you to our experts for their insights. And yes, we would love to welcome questions and answer discussion session with the audience. So please go ahead and type your questions and the person that you are directing it to into the Q&A feature chat box. I did notice that we had a question from an anonymous attendee to Sabine. To what extent have the institutions at transboundary basins been seen to show positive mobilization of the communities that surround them? And Sabine provided a pretty strong answer there, with an overall takeaway that there is room for improvement. I see that there is a question for Nidhi to answer. Please go ahead, Nidhi. You're muted.
Sorry, can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you.
So thanks for the question. Very interesting. As hydrodiplomacy is a possible, plausible, promising tool, hydrohegemony is also something that goes in tandem. So the power dynamics, the geopolitical relations that the countries have shared in the past, pretty much directly or indirectly influence how today they are agreeing or settling water conflicts, water allocations, water rights. A good debate that's happening as a nexus between hydrodiplomacy and hydrohegemony is the Great Renaissance Dam that Ethiopia and neighbors are discussing. So that's one example. There's a lot to say about that, but in the context of time, I will also give a very quick reply to the role of state and non-state actors. Transboundary water governance had conventionally been something very state-oriented. Two state representatives will talk to each other and to international governance mechanisms and agencies and platforms to make a call. But when the water future of communities, stakeholders is dependent on these negotiations, first of all, the community has a role, and it could be a state actor or non-state actor, depending on the modalities entering through formal or informal mechanisms. Through community-based organizations or through local level, state or provincial mechanisms through which they have a voice. One is that. One is the role of private sector. In the new plan for Africa development 2035, is it, if I'm remembering it right, they have given a significant emphasis on the role involving private sector corporations and businesses to create that sustainability or to implement that sustainability plan. When you're deciding that at a very high level, the implications of involving a private sector without community and stakeholder consultation is can translate into a risk if it's not operated per transparency, per inclusive and equity principles. So this is a sort of a nutshell, but I'm very happy to share some more empirical work if this point is of interest.
Thank you, Nidhi. By all means, we can share some more empirical work with our attendees, either in the chat or in a follow-up email. A question I have for Tobias is, in a lot of your work, you address some of the dark side of environmental diplomacy, including things like delegitimization or depoliticization. Can you extend a little bit more on those elements of the dark side of environmental diplomacy, where asymmetrical power structures are maintained, and how we can have a look at cases where kind of red flags start to come up in your empirical experience that you've had?
Yes, I'm happy to do so. So basically, I mean, the dark side of environmental peace building, or the dark side of environmental diplomacy, basically refers to where to one of two scenarios, basically. So one scenario is where one group of users benefits, but another group of users, usually already marginalized or poor or excluded communities, suffer further disadvantages. And I think, best example is you can consider dams in South and Southeast Asia, which are sometimes promoted as a good tool for transboundary cooperation on issues like water management, hydroelectricity generation, flood management. But I mean, quite often are very detrimental to the local people who lose their homes or livelihoods when these dams are built. You could also consider, for instance, the Yonglai channel in Sudan, which was basically a channel that Sudan and Egypt agreed on, I think back in the 50s already, basically to build a channel through a swampy area, because in the swampy area, a lot of water was basically lost. If you have a channel, the water flows straight towards it, so there's more water available that flows through the Nile, which can then be shared between the riparian states, which, I mean, sounds very positive, but obviously there were local communities who depended on the wetlands. And if you build a channel and the wetlands dry out, they lose their livelihoods. And when the South Sudan resistance staged their armed struggle in the 1980s, and they basically joined forces with the local people, one of the first things they did is to blow off the drilling equipment for the channel, because they were so annoying about it. And I mean, if you think of the Aral Sea Basin, for instance, a lot of the actual environmental cooperation is more like water overexploitation dressed up as environmental cooperation. And so I think when we need to be careful in terms of such projects, which are often labeled to be very nice instances of cooperation and peace building and water sharing, quite often also have losers and people who lose out. Not always, not necessarily. Perhaps the gains outweighs the losses. And I think the best way really to address this, and perhaps it's kind of stating the obvious, but it's to really consult with all the local user groups and get their input, and not design projects in a top-down technocratic way without considering those people who do not have the power or the resources to straightforward articulate and push for their interests.
Thank you, Tobias. That kind of segues as well to another question I have for Sabine on private actors and private interests within river basin organizations. So Nidhi also mentioned that private companies are playing more of a role in terms of developments and infrastructure and communities. In your own research and understanding of river basin organizations, to what extent has private companies either facilitated or in a way challenged the positive developments around RBOs and transboundary waters?
I'm not aware of any big private sector involvement in these intergovernmental kind of mechanisms at all. And most of the development, infrastructure developments that I'm aware of are actually state-led infrastructure developments. Most of the large dam projects in transboundary basins are actually government projects where, of course, private actors come in various ways. in that regard, private sector has not really played a big role in how RBOs work, actually. Maybe sometimes where they come in is in terms of data and information. Often private sector actually kind of collects a lot of relevant and important data that would be quite useful also for managing water resources on the transboundary level, but for several reasons, just similar also to often state agencies, they are not very willing to share this type of data. Here, I think what would be an important aspect for RBOs, but also governments, is to maybe to include these aspects actually in the treaties that they establish with private companies when it comes to constructing, developing certain infrastructure measures, to make this a little bit more accessible, also to the benefits of governments themselves, which often have no ways to getting to this type of data. And it's often a very sensitive and crucial data. So I think their governments have to play a much stronger role in exercising influence. But that's the only issue I can think of private sector playing a significant role here, but maybe the others could counter argue.
Nydia or Tobias, do you have anything to add on private sector engagement in transboundary waters?
Aqua project that was pitched, taking the note of migration flows from Sahel to Europe as a matter of Mediterranean security. So back in 80s, this discourse of involving private sector, because there was a coalition that stakeholders have to get together, and the Italian state-owned company Bonifica, which is now a corporation in itself, is not state-owned anymore, is been continuing its interest to build this big channel between Congo Basin and the Chad Basin. Lake Chad Basin. But interesting development in this this course of the project is that two more or several more private sector actors have joined the coalition. So Power China is on board through its Belt and Road Initiative. I think hydrological infrastructure has been on the top of their radar, as is of Bonifica. So I think they are trying to provide solutions, and the states are also very willing to accept those solutions. Like the Africa Development Plan, PIDA, wants a lot of finance to be sourced through private sector corporations, and for them to become an active partner in economic development. But so-called economic development is not really defined very well. How the interests and rights of communities, vulnerable groups, marginalized people are represented in this high-level discourse. So I think these are some of these complexities that are either overlooked or shadowed in these big meetings, and they should be brought on board if long-term sustainability of such collaborative interventions are to be seen in future. So yeah, maybe I'll limit it to that.
Thank you, Nidhi. We have an interesting question from Hasmik. What are the mechanisms to protect the water right of population living in conflict zones and unrecognized territories, such as Nagorno-Karabakh? Would anyone like to respond to the question? Tobias, I noticed that you were typing. Go ahead.
Yeah, I was already starting to type, then you started reading it, and I'm talking much quicker than I'm typing. So I think it's a very good question. It's a very difficult question. Perhaps Nidhi can say something more about it from my experience, and I think that also refers to areas such as Tibet or the Palestinian territories. It's really, really hard if you have no political control and hence very, very limited opportunities to drill down and build your water infrastructure to secure water rights. And I think the only realistic way is to appeal to the human right to water and gain international recognition and support for the situation, and by this way basically bridge the power inequality that exists, take the moral high ground, and convince the actual state that is in control to respect the water rights of the local population. I really don't see, but perhaps I'm not creative enough. Perhaps you have other ideas.
Nidhi or Sabine, would you like to add?
Sabine, you want to go first?
I don't really think that I have much to add. I mean, the problem in conflict zones is the absence of any government structures that would protect and ensure water rights, right? Which is kind of in most countries anyway, a government regulated. And I would even go as far as saying that it's not only a problem in conflict zones, it's also a problem in non-conflict zones, that especially the water rights of local and marginalized groups are often not considered. They are often only exist in form of informal water rights that in some cases are protected by formal law and others, and very often are not. So these communities have no way of kind of defending these rights against other potential water users. So I would say this is not even only a problem limited to conflict zones, but also goes much beyond that. But I'm sorry, I don't really have the solution. I suppose that one solution, first of all, would be to also in the assessments that we're doing, maybe also in development projects when we go in, to actually recognize these local water rights by users that are often not part of the formal water governance structure whatsoever. So maybe going in and doing really first of all an assessment, what are the water resources that are available and who's actually using them, and to see like who has a legitimate right and who has not. Maybe kind of starting with these type of assessments to at least have a picture of who actually the water users are. Often we do not even know that. Maybe that's the first step. Maybe.
The interventions from colleagues. Point one, I think we need to empower regional water commissions like the Mekong River Commission or the Lake Chad Basin Commission in their context to be integrating the agenda of water rights, to be reforming their whole mandate to contemporary water crisis and climate crisis that are interlinked. Number two is, I think, like we have seen in COPs, in the climate discourse, which is much more advanced than the water crisis discourse at the global level, that now COP has sub-national levels like cities or independent advocacy institutions. They have a seat in the room. So in these river commissions or at the regional scale, at the global scale, we need much more diverse stakeholder group to have a seat in the room, to have a voice, their voice represented in making a decision. We can start anywhere, wherever it's possible, to pick up those low-hanging fruits, to see that this becomes more inclusive if we are talking about rights. Because you can't protect someone's rights unless they are in the room. And same applies to gender rights or indigenous rights in the water domain. And I think the last thing which we have seen is, I'm going to borrow the message that came from Sabine's slide, that if you map this whole spectrum of transboundary water research and scholarship, you'll see that cooperation will still dominate conflict. And I always give this example to close my teaching in the class, is that I'm from India, and I am from that border zone between India and Pakistan, and we've seen that with all the geopolitical conflicts, the Indus Treaty was always respected. The community rights to have seasonal water, to meet their water demands, their basic provisioning right to water, drinking water, sanitation needs, was not compromised, despite the bitter relationship that a country shared, the geopolitical volatility that's been around for 75 years now. So I think there is hope in pursuing a dialogue, in putting a water agenda as a human right. That's not that should not be totally mixed up with the political agendas, but should be dealt in a separate channel through hydrodiplomacy as a possible way, but through other mechanisms, whatever are known and acceptable.
Thank you so much, Nidhi. And I think alongside that, the conversation of, land ownership linked to water, and what does that even mean when we move into transboundary cooperation, and how is that kind of the right to land ownership as well as water usage even established, because quite often the two are in policy and law brought together. Please, by all means, if the audience would like to ask any more questions, the Q&A chat box is open. Thank you, Hasmik. We'd be happy to continue the conversation. If there are no other questions, I'm aware that the webinar has gone on for over an hour, and I'm sure everyone has places to be and things to do. So thank you, everybody, for your time, for your engagement on topics that are very complex, but very important and very relevant in our day and age today. Thank you so much to Sabine, Tobias, and Nidhi for their contributions. And I look forward to following your work, because goodness knows we need it. Thank you for your time.
Thank you, Dan and MEDRC. Thank you for that.
Yes, thank you.
Bye-bye.
Thanks
Have
a
a good
lot
day.
for putting this together. Bye.
Pleasure. Thank you. Bye.
Bye-bye.